Good afternoon. My name is Scott Solberg, Associate Director of Research at the Center on Education and Work. And on behalf of the Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to an afternoon tea, a conversation series on career and workforce development policies and practice held at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An afternoon tea is also being sponsored by the Department of Counseling Psychology and the Wisconsin Career Development Association. Our guest today is Terence Tracey, Professor of Counseling Psychology at the Arizona State University, and our title for today's conversations is Innovations in Career Interests and Assessments. So Terry, welcome to an afternoon tea.
Well, thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Now, I've had a chance to read through your Vita, the many pages. It's a long book.
It's a lot of filler.
No, there's not. I don't think that's how people would respond to that. Over 100 published articles. And what I think is most amazing is the range of methods that you've used throughout your career, and constantly growing to, from using multidimensional scaling. You talked about Euclidean distance and being able to plot things and getting back to trigonometry, to IRT, to all kinds of things. I mean, in reading your work, it's reading a methodology textbook of the different range of things. I think that's exciting to see, both in the vocational psychology literature, the range of things, but I think it also speaks to the fact that you come to questions with what method is going to work to help answer, and it's given at least the profession of the vocational psychology profession just a wealth of knowledge in that area. So it's very exciting to be able to talk with you today about some of your work.
Well, I think a lot of that, I'm an old not frustrated. I was an engineer when I started out, so I did have kind of a facility with math and things like that. But I grew bored with that, and then I shifted over to the dark side, if you will, of people. So, and so but still I carried some of that, maybe some of the math stuff with me as I went on.
Using math to solve problems.
Yeah.
Okay. How did you become interested in this field? And maybe we can start back with where you began, your first occupation, or one of your early occupations.
Because I was mentioning to Scott earlier how I worked my way through college. I worked my way through college as a garbage man in Elizabeth and Newark, New Jersey, and it was quite an educational job. I did it, all summers and during Christmas vacations, and so I really enjoyed it a lot. Managed to save a fair amount of money, not because they paid me, but because I was too tired to do anything else at the end of the day. But it was as you say, an educational opportunity.
But so you became interested in engineering, and then how did you get interested in the career and kind of the vocational part of things?
Well, I went into engineering the way many people go into engineering. I was okay at math, and I had no insight into anything else as to what I should do and why. People said, well, you should be an engineer. And that, certainly in my day, and I think still probably true, the modal decision-making process for many people. And I did it, and I actually did pretty well in it, but I really didn't like either the things we were doing or, and I know I'm insulting a good portion of the world, the engineers themselves. They weren't people I really wanted to hang around with because I didn't see things quite the same way. And so maybe that was the first burgeoning of my becoming a person-environment fit person. And I went into psychology, maybe you can come somewhat like Krumholtz's ideas of serendipity. It was the only thing that I had enough courses in to get a major. I needed to declare a major, so it was going to be psychology.
So obviously you were interested in the coursework.
To some extent. I wasn't. You're also an undergraduate that was more interested in the weekend. Okay.
So not as focused early
right.
on. Boy, that's quite a difference compared to how much hard work you've been putting in the profession in terms of publication record and all. How did you choose this area of specialization then, in terms of got you into psychology?
I was in psychology, and I very much started gravitating towards the applied side. And I decided this with some of the classes in my senior year. I had some more kind of clinical psych focused classes and really working with pathology and things of that sort. Did a lot of volunteering in hospitals and really enjoyed that. So I decided, okay, I was going to be a clinical psychologist. I applied to maybe 10 programs as a senior, and got into none, and I don't blame them. My academic record was far from distinguished. No, it was distinguished in some ways. Grades not among them. So then I went out and worked for 2 years in corrections in New Jersey. I worked in halfway houses for juvenile delinquents and also taught at a school for autistic children. And liked it very much, but also really wanted to go back to school. So realizing that my undergraduate grade point average wasn't stellar, I applied to a whole bunch of schools and got into one on probation in a master's program. So I went to Kansas.
Okay.
And very much liked it there, and really I met my first vocational psychologist was, and he probably is now no longer a vocational psychologist, Jim O'Neill.
Okay.
Then we did some work together. I had my first publications working with Jim, but I still wanted to be a real serious psychotherapist. So that was where my other area of research was really going into. And I tease Jim Lichtenberg about this repeatedly now. I wanted to go on for my PhD, but Kansas wouldn't take me. So I went to Maryland and enjoyed that a lot.
Interesting. So, and how does Lichtenberg respond to that?
I'd like to rub it in as every opportunity.
Okay, all right, good. The work that we've been working with around the career stuff, you've been just leading some of the new innovations in career assessment, specifically interest assessment. And it feels as though the work you're doing with the personal globe inventory, which I'm hoping you'll talk some about, is really not just it's almost like a shift in the paradigm coming out of the Holland work with the traditional REASEC model, but you're taking it in some new directions, and it has some really exciting applications in practice. And I do want to get to that, but I also wanted to focus a little bit on John Holland. He's recently passed away. I know that the work you've been doing obviously has been out of that tradition, and just wanted to spend a little time talking about him and how you came to know his work, him personally, and just some of what you're taking from his legacy.
Well, I first met John through Jim O'Neill back at Kansas. He had gotten him to come out, and got to meet him there, and was, very much, for people that have met John, very much impressed with certainly his wit and his intelligence. Very sharp guy, and very quick to grasp things, but also very idiosyncratic, and kind of had a very good sense of humor. Was kind of good at kind of poking fun at others and taking pokes at himself, and very much liked that. And I always found his commentary remarkably refreshing, because he kind of played by John's rules.
He didn't hold back.
Not at all. And he had a very charming way of doing it. And very idiosyncratic way of doing it. So, and that was kind of fun. Even reading his commentaries, he'd do comments on things in the literature even, and it's very typically John. The rest of us, we kind of learned to right away all of our initial reactions. Nope, John's are right there on the page, and remarkably well done. So,
what was it that drew you in or your take on the REASEC, or just the whole, what he brought in? Because he really has, from an assessment perspective, he's really the centerpiece for most of the work that's
he's
done.
defined the field.
Yeah.
He has certainly single-handedly changed all interest assessment. There really isn't a credible interest assessment tool out there now that doesn't do the REASEC. It's his field.
Yeah. And he looked at this as a topology, in terms of the 6 areas. Maybe a little bit about how you grab into that, and now you're taking it into more of a circumplex as opposed to the hexagon.
Well, it kind of mathematically, a circumplex, which is a circular arrangement, and a hexagon aren't any different. It's the exact same things. It's just whether or not you want straight lines or curved lines, and so there isn't any difference between the two. The circle's a little bit more general because you can kind of expand it. some of the work that one of my colleagues, Jim Rounds, and I did early on, we really kind of want to say, okay, well, is there any truth to there being 6 types? We know that they're kind of arranged in a circle. But if these are really true entities, you should have things, answers should cluster around these 6. And several studies, we haven't found any support for that. In general, people respond to things such that they're pretty much anywhere around the circle, so it's uniformly defined. And, that's nice, and what that says is, the 6 types are arbitrary. But it also says that, so it's the circle that's important, and I can slice it any way I want. 6 is a nice number. I kind of like 8 better because you get nice symmetrical things, nice symmetrical slices of the pie. You could have 4, you could have 32. And 6 is the one that we started out with, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right, the best, or the true.
So talk a little bit about, well, let's start with the personal globe inventory then. Why develop a new measure?
At a selfish level, because it's fun. But if we didn't start out, this original work with Jim and I, we really just wanted to kind of see what kind of stuff was there. We did a lot of work kind of pretty much examining the extent to which we can generalize the RIASEC and the Hollins model to different groups, how much this is true. And so a lot of that we did, and we found some good support for it in this country, not so much internationally. But then it was kind of more, okay, so we have this, what sorts of things underlie the RIASEC structure, and that's when we started looking at it and looking at, if we start with a good broad sampling of occupations or activities, and we give them out, we get kind of that circle in terms of how people respond, but we also get 2 other things. We get a general factor, which Prediger talked about years ago, and we also get another factor which we were somewhat surprised to find is prestige, because generally we don't like to talk about that. So here we found results that no one really had found before, and so that really said, okay, so maybe that argues for a new scale. And so we didn't start out, or I certainly didn't start out when I was putting together the final parts of it, to construct a scale, but it was more, what do we have, how can I understand it, and then slowly, since there isn't anything out there, kind of constructing a scale from it.
You mentioned the U.S. versus international work, and you've been doing a lot of research internationally. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you see as in comparing cross-culturally.
Okay, well, originally we found that the RIASEC circle does not fit well as soon as you leave the U.S. And that seems pretty much true across countries, even similar countries, Australia, Canada, Great Britain. Places where you think it's going to be similar, but it doesn't fit.
Are there any patterns in that not fitting?
We kind of looked at a lot of things, gross national product, different characteristics of the culture, and really didn't find too much other than it fits here and doesn't fit too many other places. And so that's also part of it. So now, with a different instrument, kind of constructing it somewhat differently. And part of it is, it might be just a basis of how we define RIASEC. In the PGI, we have 8 things around the circle instead of 6. One of the nice things I like about it, and one of the bad things about it is, the 8 types make sense just in their name. RIASEC is a remarkably nice little mnemonic. Probably not as good as Costa McCrae's Ocean, but it's a nice little mnemonic. PGI doesn't have that, but...
Well, let's talk about the 8th then that you're...
Well, but let me just talk, so we don't know what realistic, if you're not fully immersed in the field, you don't have no idea what realistic is, you have no idea what enterprising is, you have no idea what investigative is. Is it a detective?
Sure.
Is it a cop? So you need a lot of knowledge. And so test takers don't have that knowledge, so it's real hard for them to use this information. So if we could come up with some labels, or the 8 seemingly are a little bit more straightforward, everybody knows what mechanical is, everybody knows what helping is. So we tried, when I came up with the labels for those, try and choose names that fit well and that were easily understandable. So in that sense, test takers could use it better. And so and I think it's helpful in that regard. But transporting it internationally, I've, with different colleagues, some in China, certainly our work in Singapore, its application in Italy, we have some applications in several other places. It is doing a better job of fitting in those countries than the 6 types are. Okay. So is that the function of just the 6? I'm not sure, but maybe 6 is too few, or it's just how we're constructing the 6. So it seems to do a better job across national boundaries in capturing it.
In the RIASEC, are there 1 or 2 of the subscales that have most difficulty in terms of translating across cultures? They're maybe too complex or just not?
I don't know. I think the issue in translating across cultures is, well, first the type of scales. A lot of the scales rely upon occupations. They translate abysmally. That's just too hard. Few cultures have the same occupations. I'm working with someone right now in Iran, and they wanted to do the whole PGI, which has occupations but also activities. And so just things like bartender. There are no bartenders in Iran. So he didn't so coffee attendant was kind of what he was offering as an equivalent, or dance instructor. The only thing they had that matched that, was even close, was aerobics. So it's very different. You can't do these things.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. The other one is, I think the RIASECs are very. They're constructs we've created, and it's not always clear what's in them and what's not.
So when you say we've created, we're not sure all this can be exported.
Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously with the different range of occupations and different cultural beliefs on things. And you mentioned the prestige piece.
Well, I think that's a big
that
one.
can impact things a lot too then in terms of how they fall out.
Well, I think that's one of the things in our country, the RIASEC, it's confounded with prestige. Some of the types have more prestige than others. Investigative, oftentimes very high prestige. Enterprising occupations, it's got a lot of prestige in there, particularly we start talking about managers and people who run things.
You get to conventional.
And you get the conventional, which the way it's defined in most scales is pretty much low prestige.
And social's kind of in between depending on where you put it. So yeah, that's very, and R would be depending on whether you're working indoors, outdoors, what you're doing with it.
And so oftentimes it's very confounded, and that often comes up. Whereas if you take prestige out, it becomes cleaner.
And if you stick with activities, it's easier to generalize, I assume, across cultures.
Much easier, because everybody does the same things. But jobs don't have the same structure characteristics across cultures.
Okay, very interesting, very interesting. And what, and where are you going with the PGI in the sense of what do you see as some of the next frontiers of either research or conceptual base? You've got the circumplex.
Well, I got the circumplex. There are 2 things. One is refining the instrument, and currently now it's normed, and it's rather lengthy, which is good and bad. But I've just finished a project where I'm using IRT methods to kind of really shorten it and kind of come up with a kind of PGI light that kind of has nice response characteristics across gender and age. And so it's a nice way of refining it and coming up with very nice items.
And so getting a shorter version makes it more accessible. And how do people get connected to the PGI? I mean, in terms of using it, most everyone, the self-directed search is out there. The ONET has the interest profiler.
Right.
Where is the PGI being used in a? If we've got school counselors watching and stuff, they get
we have, actually, I'll do a little plug here.
Sure.
I've been working with John Horan, one of the faculty at ASU, and he's done a very nice job of putting up what he calls a virtual counseling center. And it is to a large extent. And you can go there, it's free service, anybody can log on, get your own account. And you can do a variety of things, of which PGI is one. He has done a remarkably good job of hooking up pretty much tons of different occupational data sets. And it's a very nice opportunity. And so the PGI is there. You can take it. It's scored for you. Prints up a nice profile. Kind of gives it to you. There are also some measures there for children. There's also a career thinking pattern scale that I've been playing with. And so anyway, the plug is vcc.asu.edu.
Okay. All right.
And certainly, you know, the PGI is also that was my plug. Now, it's certainly it's one of the things we've been working with together. It's available. Certainly, we're using it in Singapore, and
It'll be, yeah, we're going to be using it within the WIS career system as well,
and using
accessing that in our
which
career
is,
locker.
I'm looking forward to, which is cool.
It is exciting in the sense that I think the Circumplex gives some interesting way, like you said, more accessible information to the student, especially when we break it down out of the RIASEC and into some of the titles. It helps the student grab onto it, and make some meaning out of it, which is really, really exciting.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about training in terms of, we've got a lot of people working in schools. We've got a lot of pressure right now to get students to figure out their life goals, because if they don't figure out their occupational goals, they're not taking the right courses, and if they're not taking the right courses, then they're not preparing for post-secondary, or they've wasted time and have to take remedial. There's a big emphasis right now on planning, starting in middle school and then through the high school. How do you see the career interest assessment process playing into that?
Well, I certainly see it, not from an unbiased perspective, but integral to that whole process. Here, you know, we need people to make decisions. We need people to make decisions. We're asking them earlier and earlier.
Is middle school too early to be involved in that?
No, I think actually middle school is the time we really want to intervene. A lot of my research looking at children's interests and competence as they age really shows that that's the time that's crucial. For elementary school children, they tend to have fairly undifferentiated interests, and their competence tends to be somewhat undifferentiated and also increasing over time. They feel better about their ability to do stuff. They feel better about they like a whole lot of stuff. But in several studies, the shift into 6th grade, for both boys and girls, their interest levels across the board drop, and more importantly, their competence perceptions across the board drop. And that's even more so for girls.
And is that, why is that, do you think?
Well, you know, to some extent, I think there are two things. One, probably puberty, maturation, all sorts of stuff kind of everything. It's
maturation's kicking in.
I never want to teach that group, but because it's a very difficult group to work with, because all of a sudden the body's going through all sorts of different changes. And so there is that, and so they have to deal with all that, and how can they reckon where there are all these changes, and how do I kind of assess that? And the other one is just the social structure of middle school is appreciably different from elementary school, and all of a sudden competition takes on a whole new perspective, and people are competing much more openly with each other, and so they are now having to sort out much faster than they did before where each person stands in that kind of hierarchy.
And it seems like we're putting much more emphasis in our society on the right courses at that period of
and
time.
that's kind of it makes it
to
very
prepare
difficult
for high school, which prepares for post-secondary.
And that wasn't true earlier, but and so these choices are having to be made, but that's why I think it's a crucial time to go in there and start doing some intervention. One, to help start heading off some of those, obviously less desirable hits to people's self-esteem and hits to their perception of what they like and dislike, and I can't do that anymore. Last year I felt I could. This year I can't. And that could have consequences for selecting curriculum and kind of ruling out things far too prematurely.
And so getting some assessments in probably as they're transitioning into middle school to begin kind of thinking about an occupational anchor. Right? And then what things would you want to see happening in schools then to help kind of not so much crystallize the occupational choice, but getting them engaged in the process of thinking about future and then connecting it back to their coursework?
Well, and I think probably the area we're concerned most with is girls in kind of math and science sorts of courses, because that's the one that took the biggest hit in investigative interest and competence perceptions just kind of took a bigger nosedive for girls and boys.
Okay.
So, you know, what kind of things can we do there? So certainly one, to get an assessment of that, is this kind of going on? Who is it going on with, too? Because it's not, you know, there's a general trend, but some people it's more than others. And try and get them more engaged in it. And I certainly think, you know, how do we kind of increase interest? And I think, you know, most of the literature is focused on, certainly all the interventions are focused on increasing the competence of girls.
Right.
If you can be good at it, then you will stay in it.
Right.
And to some extent that's true, but also I think the focus is perhaps more on increasing the interest, making the things enjoyable, and that will drive it, I think, in some sense more than yet another competence I have to attain. And I think the programs, or at least my reading of the literature, is the programs that do more of that part seem to have a more effect on the girls staying in it, keeping involved in it, because that is what drives subsequent enrollment is, well, yeah, hey, math is pretty cool. Versus, you know, well, I can do it, but I'm not going there.
So actually enjoying the work I'm doing, not just being good at it.
Right.
And maybe even seeing some ways I can apply it, or ways that I'm able to use this in exciting ways. You know,
Well,
what are the occupations that might be of some interest that use those skills? I have you thinking, so that must
Well,
be
I'm
either
trying
you
to think
agree
of-
or disagree.
My take on it is a little bit premature to focus on occupations at that age.
Okay.
What are the things you like to do? What are the things that are familiar?
At the activity level.
At the activity level, and that mostly involves things I do in my day-to-day life. So that's school projects, that's science projects, that's math projects, maybe outside play, those activities that I can get involved in. Occupations are an awfully far way away. Abstract reasoning at that age fluctuates by second, and so being able to kind of make that grasp to that far ahead, I'm not sure that it's made intimately. I mean, I might
So
understand what.
Right. Well, we're talking from a Piagetian perspective, concrete to the formal
Well,
operations, and being able to think of a future sense and
And that's an
abstract.
evolving sort of thing, and it comes over time. But, you know, more immediate, you know, we're talking middle school, they talk about and what they do in their daily lives, and that has more substance and that affects more choices than the longer term goals. The way I saw this is, I did some research in terms of structure of interest in kids, and I started with third graders, third and fourth graders. And I had a nice instrument that works nicely for middle school and works nicely for high school, and even college students it works nicely for. Younger kids, it didn't work. They think about things differently. And I was really struggling. You know, I'd have, it kind of looked like Reasec, but it wasn't. Some of the items were out of place, and I was really struggling with what it was. And maybe helpfully, Erin, if you ever see this, it's my daughter. She's the one that gave me the answer. So she was 8 at the time, and I'm talking about, well, what do we have here? And one of them I could kind of understand. It seemed to be things boys do and things girls do. That's how elementary school kids kind of structure it. You know, well, that's boy things and that's girl things. Okay, that makes sense. But the other one I couldn't quite grasp. And she just walks in and she you know, she looks at it and she goes, she's 8. And she says, well, stuff in school, stuff out of school. Work, play. And they pay you? And so this
she
is out of
categorized it perfectly.
So she had it perfectly, and but these are the salient things for kids. And so I think we need to kind of take advantage of how our audience thinks about things. And so occupations are nice, but that's not what they're thinking about.
Right.
It's more day-to-day activities, and that's going to be what I choose to do now, what courses I might choose to do, because I like them, rather than it will help me be a scientist.
So the category formation in that elementary school is almost the structure of their life.
Well, that's what it is, and that's what it always is for all of us. And
then
it changes.
And then as they get into middle school, what you're focusing on is, as they get into the activities, what does that say about who you are?
And that's it.
And we start really building that self-awareness, but again, tied to the things that they enjoy doing, and us building interventions to keep that confidence going. We're not wanting to lose, for example, girls that have an investigative propensity,
Right.
because all of a sudden they feel less efficacious, so they're feeling something's going on emotionally or through change, and then they're using that as feedback that they're incapable. We need to design systems to keep them feeling competent.
Well, I think the biggest part of that is, particularly with the girls, is you're right. The day-to-day existence is the social circles, these social constraints that we work on. What group you're in, what group you're not.
Right.
All those wonderful things we remember about that age, and that's what affects the liking. So if you like math, obviously you can't be in this group, or that identifies you in a certain way, and that's the things we can kind of work on. Perhaps setting up some structures such that my liking things isn't necessarily going to be detracting from an important part of my social network.
Right.
And setting up the networks where that's kind of cool. It's cool to do that.
So much in school talking about linking the academic, the personal, social, and the career, and you're bringing that in, that to the extent that the social networks and the social groups are playing a big role in who I want to be and where I want to go.
That is
as
the
an
role.
Organization, we have to manage that in some way. We have to find ways to break that up and keep them focused on some of the fun activities that they enjoyed earlier on.
Right, so they don't prematurely drop them.
So when is the shift then to bring occupation information in? When would you, if you were designing the school system, when would you bring that in?
Well, I don't have a problem with bringing it in then, but I don't think that's the focus.
Shouldn't be the focus.
The focus should be
They can
more,
learn about it. You can go on field trips, see
that's
some
always
role
good.
models, as long as it's enjoyable, fun, project-based.
and that's why that'd be fine, but I can't expect them to intimately attach the things they're doing today and the choices I'm making about classes to that occupation.
Right. The categories aren't going to be ready
Yeah,
yet.
they don't. But certainly that knowledge is good, somewhat like, yes, they can't always attach math concepts to stuff that they'll do far later, but then math is kind of cool. That you can keep them going on.
Right. So when do we make the shift? When do we start bringing in more occupation focused?
I don't think it's a shift. I'd say it's a gradual thing. You just keep going, and you kind of make those connections longer and longer in time.
You give opportunity, and they'll naturally gravitate when they're ready. They'll start to use some of those occupational connections.
As they get more knowledge, they can do that. So I give them occupational knowledge, but we can't ask kids to make the direct connection at 7th grade to what I'm going to major in college.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well,
they would even say as senior in college, it's tough too.
Right. Oh, yeah. There you go. There too. Yeah.
That there needs to be some flexibility and adaptability built into this,
and tied to daily life. Yeah, and what they're doing, because that's what matters.
What some questions? I want to just flip a couple of places. One of them is, we do have a lot of people that are coming into the field. They're in graduate training right now. We look at the amount of work you've done through your career. Sue Whiston had asked from Indiana, how does someone like Terry Tracey, how is he so prolific? What's the secret in terms of how you have managed your career? I don't know if you remember, but I walked in and asked you that one day.
I do remember that. That was many years ago.
I will tell you that the advice you gave me then was my template for the next, it's still my template. And even though I got other advice from other people, I was able to stay focused on what you had said. So I was hoping you could kind of share some of your ideas on that. And I'm sure it's changed since, but I think you had a very clear plan of action as a scientist and how to do it.
I gave you, as I recall, the pragmatic recommendation was always have different projects at different stages. And I think that's always good advice because things have up times and down times, and they even out if you have several going on. So why I've been able to do what I've done, I've been lucky. And again, as my same daughter says, I have no life. I certainly don't agree with either, though I think I have been lucky. But part of it is we got a great job.
You enjoy it.
And we get paid, not a lot, but we get paid to do pretty much whatever we find interesting. And that's pretty cool.
And how much you found interesting?
Well, that's kind of, we get paid. I couldn't do this stuff in business. No, they tell you what to do. So it's kind of like, well, this is kind of cool. And I have changed and remade myself. I'm a Johnny-come-lately vocational psychologist. Most of my work.
In other words, there's always time to find the light. In other words,
that's just one way to decipher that. Okay. There you go. I finally saw the light.
Okay, good.
My first study was in vocational psychology, and then I had a fairly substantial hiatus.
But you came back.
But I came back. There you go. I came back to the womb. So,
But let's talk about it. You said having things in different stages. So things need to be, talk a little bit about what those phases are when you think about projects.
well, there certainly is always the kind of thinking about designing stage, and that goes on oftentimes for a while, and it's not a deliberate stage in some ways. It's kind of, you're always thinking about things. But then kind of the data collection often takes a while. You can't do a lot about it. And then once you get the data, it's usually pretty quick. You get the data, you can analyze it, and it's not that big a deal. But getting the data often takes a long time, and you're not doing anything else during that time. So you can have another project where you're analyzing data or writing up that data project. And so between the writing and the analyzing and the data collection, there are going to be some
So you're managing a pipeline of projects. And I've heard you say as well, watching that pipeline, that when you get too much data, you may end up stop with ideas and data collection, which is going to then slow the rhythm down. And it's about balancing that pipeline at all times. And I guess what was most interesting about it is it gave permission to keep coming up with new ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Keep coming up with the steps to keep moving, but balance out the other part, getting the stuff out, getting stuff into print. And things like that.
Yeah, no, so it's always kind of keeping it moving forward, but because, yes, if it gets too big at the end, you're stuck. And you got a backlog, and then you can't do anything else.
Yes, and then you're constantly writing and
you're trying to
doing
get
nothing
out from
new
under,
else.
and nothing else is going on.
We have some questions that are coming in, and we've had a lot, like Rosie Berry from Minnesota and Christopher Ettinger from northeastern Iowa. And it has to do with the assessments, and I think what we're talking about here is how do we choose the right assessment for the right populations? Are there some that you are drawn towards as we think of a battery of assessments, or what if we're in a career center or we're working with different populations, how should we be thinking as professionals about the kinds of assessments we should use? And then your advice on that.
Certainly, as always, you want the best assessments you can get, and you want to be able to look at, evaluate reliability and validity sorts of information, and see that they really are substantial enough to meet your needs. I mean, whatever it is you're going to use it on. So, obvious examples, very good instruments in some contexts are not good in others. So, like the Strong is a very good instrument, particularly for kind of college sorts of age. But if I'm working in the high school where most of the kids aren't going to college, it's not a good measure, even though it's got a lot of support for it. It's just it doesn't have the occupations, isn't really geared toward that kind of group. So it really depends upon the population I'm trying to kind of apply it to, and really looking for instruments that are strong in that sort of setting. And that means that there isn't other than the PGI, that isn't a good test across all contexts, and I was being facetious. So I think that's probably the biggest thing is what the drawback to that is it requires that I, as a test user, do some exploration about and thinking about who it is I want to use it on, and explore a little bit what might be the best test for that context.
And so one of the things we brought up when we were talking about the middle school sample is, what am I assessing when it comes to career interests? Am I assessing occupational information? And you're mentioning, is it all at a college or an assumed college level in terms of the occupations? Is it at more of an activity base, which would be more generalizable across
I certainly
age groups?
think activities are the way to go. I'm not unique in that. Dale Prediger's been saying that for years. And I'm just slow to come around. Particularly for the younger groups, I mean, that makes a lot more sense. Giving occupation items to a group like, so how much would you like being a plumber? Many
What
kids
does that
have
mean?
no idea what that means, or aerospace engineer. Well, does that mean I'm going up in rockets?
Well, and it seems that the emphasis of the assessment changes. If assessment is to tell you the answer of who you're to be, then if we can come up with the right occupation, we're in great shape. If the assessment's designed to help you become aware of the things you're interested in and a range of things you can apply it into, then it's really more in supporting that exploration and your competence in looking at the world of work. And it seems like there has been a shift in our profession, at least in some writings, away from career choice making,
Right.
and really around the decision-making process, that decision-making readiness. And so that seems to be echoed in the idea of, why do you like the things you do?
Right.
And if we can answer that question, that really provides a pretty good foundation for thinking about the world of work.
It provides a nice structure for me to kind of approach the information, be able to take it in.
Make
and-
meaning out of
and
it.
make meaning out of it, I mean, certainly. And to use it and play with it. If I'm coming up with the right occupation, one is I don't think you can do it, but even if that were possible.
What's the label tell me?
Yeah.
How does it connect to me? What does it really mean?
So-
And it really is based then on your past experience, and that could be done on economic status, it could be done on a lot of different things
Well, very much so.
in terms of that. Okay.
And so the goal is to help the child or the adolescent be able to do more of that, do it for him or herself, so he or she can understand it and then apply it.
How, we have some, Joanna Durso from Stony Brook. We also had some others that are asking about the relationship between the career interest assessment and other psychological assessments. And I think it can be a broad question in the sense of, how do you see this as part of psychological assessment? But then also, how do we connect it with a full battery if we're working in a center that is using a lot of assessments?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting question that many people have looked at. How much, what are interests and how do they overlap with other, what some people might call more core personality aspects? And there's certainly some interesting stuff, certainly some of the work by Ackerman, kind of laying out a template of just all kind of assessments and how they relate to each other, including intelligence and the Big Five and reassess stuff. But a lot of it is, yes, there is some overlap, but in some ways there's surprisingly little overlap. I mean, some of the scales are related to some of the others. So what we have here is some measures, some constructs that are measuring something different than just basic personality types. And that gives it some real predictive power in terms of, this is different stuff, you're not going to get this on any other test, and this is going to be more directly related to daily choices I make with regards to activities, and that's kind of related to occupations. So it is unique in terms of the domain it covers. Not that it's not related to some of these others, but still it's a pretty modest relation.
It seems like part of the answer, or part of the thinking about this, has to also get down to, what are our assumptions about personality? And you were mentioning, this overlap. Perhaps some of the interest assessment, or the interest part of this, has more dynamic qualities than what's assumed in the Big Five, that we're measuring more trait-like processes. You measure, for example, in the PGI, you're measuring their competence, their sense of competence or self-efficacy for these activities, and you're saying, look, in middle school and probably throughout school, we need to be finding learning opportunities to help continue building that sense of competence. That points to a kind of a dynamic component, that what I'm interested in are things I feel I can do well.
Right.
And yet, it feels like a lot of the other assessments in terms of personality are really coming from a different framework. And just wondering about that, how you see interests and kind of the trait, disposition, what is all that? What's your take on all of that?
Well, it's an interesting kind of issue, and certainly one that there isn't any answer on. A lot of my research, particularly the developmental stuff with children, is looking at interest as a kind of developing, growing reaction to the environment, how we kind of sort that out over time. And so, a lot of this happens particularly during the adolescent years. And that certainly makes intuitive sense. And so therefore, I don't think about it, many people don't think about it as much as kind of a strong trait kind of background. However, in terms of some of what we do know about some of the measures, if we look at some of the research looking at kind of the reliability of some of the measures over time, they're not that different than they are for some of the personality measures. because they are much more labile with regard to adolescents than they are with adults. I mean, once you get to an adult, you're kind of set. But for adolescents, they're kind of somewhat lower. But so I could make the case. I don't think about it. I don't endorse it as much. That well, maybe it isn't that different. And certainly, as we were talking before, you have some people who believe that no interest, and there's a lot of research to say that there's a lot of genetic support for interests. And certainly some Tom Bouchard's work and many of those kind of do support for that. Linda Gottfredson kind of makes that interests are kind of what drive us, and when we have them, and they're fairly stable. My reading of the research is, and there certainly needs to be a lot more done, is that there's probably some legitimacy to both sides. They are labile, they do change, they do react to the environment, but there is some consistency to them also.
Well, and it seems like if, from the developmental psychology perspective, if what we're talking about is a 50-50 contribution, even in Bouchard's work, talking about as a 50-50.
That's about 50-50,
Okay.
yeah.
So is it a half empty, half full? Which are we focusing on? Are we stepping back and saying, okay, go genes? Or are we stepping in and saying, how do we embed an individual with an environment that helps them reach their true potential?
Well, I think in some ways it's an artificial distinction. If I say, well, heck, these are genetic, just test them and plug them in and we're done. I don't think anybody advocates that, and I think that versus the other side is it's entirely developmental, and let's just take everybody and move them along.
They're total plastic, and we can just move them through.
So I think it's both, and I'm not sure that should change what we do. I mean, certainly we can do some assessment, find out where the kids are, but then also work with them as in terms of meeting their environment, interacting with their environment, to kind of take advantage of what plasticity there is.
Well, and you had mentioned, though, too, and I think it probably would be borne out in developmental psychology as well, is that you may have great potential, but if you're not provided the environmental support systems, it's going to wane. And once it wanes, it may be harder to get back.
Yeah.
And so the optimal learning environment becomes kind of the focus then that you said in your first piece on middle school. What's that optimal experience need to be? If we're focusing on that, it doesn't really matter, does it?
Right, and that's it. Regardless
it doesn't
of
matter
how
what
I
the
think about
assumptions are, as long as we're focused on what we can change and what we can work with.
And that's, so I kind of try, well, one is I do want to know kind of where you're starting. So assessment's a big part of that. But then how can I help you develop in whatever that is?
Well, and it seems, too, that, I mean, what I found fascinating with Nancy Betts's work, even at the college level, is being able to change some of the realistic interests. And the idea that I can put you in an intervention, I mean, we're not just talking about to have a class, but a real intervention, and you come out saying, yeah, this is fun. This is enjoyable, which goes back to what you said as well.
Well,
if
I think that's it.
the investigative and realistic things are enjoyable and fun, people tend to be moving in those directions, or at least open to experiences in those directions. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's about being well-rounded and having some adaptability.
Oh yeah, no, and I think that is a very good thing. Also, it certainly we could be fairly planful about how we do some of those interventions, but say particularly in middle school. How can we build in some rewards for girls to do this stuff and get rid of some of the competition?
Right. And the idea then being that there's still a lot more we can do then around STEM interests among girls and things like that, that you would see it as this is still an uncharted territory.
Oh yeah.
We can do a lot more, because we have those who say, well, it's always been here, so whatever, it's not going to change. But if, again, focusing on activities, focusing on enjoyment, making it a learning, project learning based type thing, could go a long way in moving the track in a pipeline of girls into those areas.
Right. So things are sailing into them, yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to have a chance for people to ask some questions. I think we've gone a little bit long on some of the conversations. But if someone would like to come up while we're working on continuing our conversation on here. What would you consider to be your most, what's the most exciting research piece you've ever done, or the piece that's most meaningful to you? You've done a lot, I know, but I just, in terms of thinking back, and it may not be career. The Working Alliance work was certainly very exciting.
No, it was probably my dissertation. I thought I had the most fun doing that.
Yeah.
And it was on the interaction styles between client and therapist. So that one was, in part, so maybe it was one of the earliest ones that I did completely by myself and kind of using new stuff and playing around with new stuff. So it was actually that in part, so maybe it was more because it was among the first projects, and so I really liked that.
And it really sparked a whole genre of research in terms of connecting into that relational base that was going on between therapist and client. And it's certainly it's getting applied now in career as well, but it really was a very powerful area of research and counseling
Oh,
psychology.
well, thanks. Yeah, no, and I enjoyed it. It was really a lot of fun to do.
One of the bigger cited pieces is your work in this area, I believe, right? In terms of as people have been citing your work, this Working Alliance piece, your name comes up constantly.
Well, that one's different. That one is one good way to get yourself cited is you kind of come up with an instrument. And that one was kind of,
That was a big
this
instrument.
was around there, and I kind of, somebody else did the instrument, I just tweaked it
a
and
little
shortened
bit.
it. So that's kind of why, I can't, it's not that big a deal.
Not full credit for that one.
I can't take full credit for that,
All right.
no.
Okay.
So,
All right. Yes, Chris.
Yes, good afternoon.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Tracey, for coming. I do have a question for you. My name is Chris Easton. I'm a team member of the center. And my question is around training on the personal globe inventory. Maybe give me a sense of what would be some of the best strategies to actually train staff that would be introducing the PGI to clients. They may be very familiar with the RIASEC,
right.
but now with this PGI introduction, can you give us a sense of the difference of how that would be and what would be the best strategies to start with someone new to your assessment?
No, it's a very good question.
Can you repeat the question so we
Oh, okay. So let me see if I can kind of capture the question. How would I kind of roughly teach or introduce people who are familiar with the RIASEC to the PGI such as they could use it? Is that a good summary? Okay. Well, and the way I do it is, I have a few PowerPoint slides on this, but take advantage of the RIASEC and talk about the RIASEC. Present certainly the RIASEC as it exists on a circle, and then talk about that these are not set in stone 6 types, and that they're somewhat arbitrary, and that on that circle you can just as easily have these 8, which is what I use. And so you can clearly see how the 8 and the RIASEC 6 align, and that, roughly we have social has been broadened to being helping and social facilitating, and we've kind of moved investigative in part of that confound up to higher prestige. And so by putting them together, you can kind of use the knowledge you have to kind of just add to it. So I don't see the PGI as really, it is Holland, it's taking Holland's ideas, it's kind of just expanding them a little bit. So maybe it's a little bit more general than Holland. So I'm not claiming any great new insights, it's just like, take the stuff he did, tweak it a little bit differently. I do think the addition of prestige is an interesting one and makes sense in many contexts. And that's the one that's really getting a lot more attention in other countries, because that's so much more part of the culture in some of these other places, that this really helps them understand that. Also, the measurement of it's somewhat challenging because that changes a lot across culture. What is prestigious in our culture doesn't translate well to what's prestigious in other cultures.
Interesting.
The other one, is a general factor, and that's more of a research issue. But yeah, so that's the PGI. And one of the benefits, and talking to Dave, one of the liabilities of the PGI is it's got too many damn scales, because it measures everything. But, and this is kind of where I see it as perhaps this is one of the areas I'd like to expand in, this kind of user interface. As it's currently designed, it's somewhat rough. Everybody gets a different interpretation based upon how they respond. So, in computer adaptive testing, generally that's defined as, like the GRE, you go and you get a different test from everybody else. fine. What I'm talking about is you get a different interpretation from everybody else. You get an interpretation that's based on you, your scores. So a lot of your scores are going to be smack dab in the middle, and basically they don't mean anything to you. Why focus on all of them? Focus on the scores that are most salient to you as an individual. So if prestige is cool, if that's something that we see in your answers, we give you lots of prestige information. If that's not, who cares? Why do you need to see 15 scales that give you information on this? It's there, but we kind of downplay the highlighting of it. So anyway, to kind of get, before I went off, before I divagated, where I wanted to kind of, what I do is really kind of use the knowledge that many of the professionals have about the RIASEC, expand it a bit so they can see how this is a little bit different, and then talk about the additional prestige to that.
Very cool, very cool. Another question?
You threatened to heckle. Is this going to be true?
No heckling. Thank you for coming. Over the years, I've worked with our job centers in the state of Wisconsin, and I'm always asked, what's a good assessment to use? Many of our offices were using the old GATB test, the ability profiler, the SDS, and would your instrument be good for adults that are coming into our job centers now? Many of them are unemployed, lost their jobs, being laid off.
Right.
And how long would it, the assessment take? Because I always get asked, if this is too long,
It's
we're
too
not
long,
going
I
to
don't want to
use
do it, yeah. Well, it depends. I think certainly, I think it's going to be, it would be very good, particularly with adults coming back. And it can be a little bit long, and if you think that that's a problem, we got some other instruments that might be good in backup, particularly for someone who doesn't, maybe whose reading level isn't real good. I have it's called the ICA. It's much more basic and kind of gives you RIASEC scores. But the PGI is going to be good because it's going to give a bunch of pretty specific scores in a wide variety of fields. And perhaps, and certainly, it covers more fields than, like the Strong or some others, but it's a broader perspective across the whole range of kind of levels, whereas many tests kind of have their niche for level. So in that sense, I think it's fairly useful.
Okay.
And again, it depends on the purpose.
And
So
certainly what it is you want to
if
get
it's
for them.
exploration and connecting yourself to the world of work, if it's specifically, I need a job now,
Well, it's not going to certainly help at that at all. It might help you at least think a little bit more about which sorts of jobs you might enjoy a little bit more. So, and that hopefully comes into the discussion a little bit. But if it comes down to just any job, certainly that's a priority, and you take any job.
and the reason why that's important is we have many people who've lost a job where this is a great opportunity to begin really re-examining
In
themselves.
some sense, it does provide that, particularly if it's hard finding a new one. Okay, where would I like to go if I had the options? Because the economy isn't going to stay down forever. And so how can I position myself such that I can kind of get in an area where I would be happiest?
And that might mean more training or more other education, but at least I'm now kind of restarting the
Yep.
process. And the PGI would be helpful for something like that.
I think the PGI would be helpful. One of the things, this is an offshoot, the career clusters, which is kind of, the mandated coding for many occupations, and certainly educational programs have to organize and sort people into career cluster groupings so they can report these data. The predominant measure out there is kind of it's called the Career Clusters Interest Survey. There have never been any psychometric tests of this, other than one I just had a student do. It doesn't measure much. While the clusters are nice, the CCIS doesn't, we haven't found support that it measures much of the interest domain. So,
We need to be using reliable and
we
valid
need
measures.
to be using reliable and valid.
And to
there are
what
few that
purpose?
do that,
We
yeah.
have to also be clear as professionals what the intention is, and matching
Yeah.
those up.
Would it also help in the area of like transferable skills? This person came in, say he worked at a GM plant and he was a welder for 20 years and he's saying, I can't do this anymore. There's no jobs out there. Would it help in looking to explore other areas?
Well, that's a very good point. And I think that's one of the things that certainly interest tests can help people do. They can help them organize it so they can think about the things it is they like doing and the things that they feel good at doing, and that gives them a template for how to kind of go out and think about other things that they can do. Such that, okay, well, these are the things that I did as a welder, these are the aspects I liked about that. Then I have an idea of, okay, where else would that similar sorts of stuff go on? And what are the aspects of that that I really like, and how could I move that around? So instead of only focusing on the specific skills that that individual has, if you focus on kind of how he thinks about it and how the stuff he likes and feels good at matches with other occupations, it gives him a bit broader perspective.
Good, thank you.
We have time, I think, for one more question. Thank you, Roger.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm Kimberly Howard. I'm an assistant professor here at UW-Madison, and I have a question that is actually related to some of a conversation you were having before, to the question that was asked by Mr. East, and some of the discussion that you just had. Here at the university, I teach primarily the school counseling and the vocational psychology career development classes. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about how school counselors in particular might use the PGI as part of their larger career development program, how they might use that in the middle school and how they might use that in the high school. What are some of the ways that you would like to, the developer of this measure, that you would like to see it being applied and supporting the positive career development of middle school and high school youth?
Well, I don't think it should be used in middle school. It really is, it's a little bit long, it's got activities that maybe children aren't as familiar with. I do have an inventory of children's activities that's much more basic on things that kids do day to day. They're familiar with them, they know whether they like them, they know whether they're good at them. So I'd say that would be a better measure, particularly for up to 7th or 8th grade. Because it better fits with them and it gives them a structure with which to think about things. After that, I think the PGI is fine. But it's more mature, it's asking different things, it's a bit more removed from their day-to-day life. And so again, I think it's real crucial that we tie the things to what people are doing, what's salient to them today, and that's how they can understand it. So, if we're talking about occupations, that's nice, but that's out there. This is how I organize my day. I find that I like I activities. Isn't that cool? Or I like S activities. And so, because I'm doing that right now. And that makes it real.
That's great. All right. Okay. Well, this has been an afternoon tea with the Center on Education and Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
No tea.
Well, water and tea.
Vodka.
Visit our website at cew.wisc.edu to find out about our annual Careers Conference, our online career information system, the WISC Careers and Career Locker systems, as well as our other professional development opportunities related to translating career and workforce policy and research into practice. Information on how to view our afternoon tea conversations along with the readings for each session is also available on our website. I want to thank Jennifer Lindwall again for her invaluable contributions. She really behind the scenes is helping to coordinate and do some of the correspondence to get things out. Nancy and Anthony from our staff for graphics, and also our co-sponsors, the Department of Counseling Psychology and the Wisconsin Career Development Association. Thanks again to the Pyle Center and the UW Extension for the use of the facility and the technology support. There's actually a lot of people behind the scenes here, and there's a lot of putting this together, which makes the day very easy on our end, but I know they work very hard at this. On behalf of our staff at the Center on Education Work, I want to express our thanks to Terence Tracey for today's conversation. Thank you.